Hey, thanks for joining me again. It's John Vibes, and today I'm going to reflect back on political movements like Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party and explore how they were completely foundational to the media hellscape that we know and despise today. In my intro video, I talked a little bit about myself and my background, so if you missed that, you may want to go back and check it out. Also, it would be a huge help if you like and subscribe since I'm rebuilding from scratch after being gone for 5 years. I have some ideas I want to share with you, though, and I want to start by focusing on a short era that took place over a decade ago and set the conditions for everything that came after. The smartphone was first released in 2007, but it didn't become widely popular in 2011. So before then, people weren't constantly connected, and the internet was still more of an accessory in our lives or a source of entertainment than the ubiquitous thing that it is today. This is important because this time frame between 2007 and 2011 is when the culture of the internet was mainstreamed. And by that, I mean that internet culture went from something that was created by a small group of hobbyists to something that the entire mainstream culture was now participating in. I'm kind of old, so I was able to watch a lot of this evolve. In the early 2000s, most of the political discussions online were shaped around the Iraq War, and then a few years later, the bailouts and the financial crash of 2008. With both of these issues, the media was running defense for a corrupt corporate establishment, which has probably happened throughout much of human history. But now there was this thing called the internet, which allowed anyone with a connection to counter the narrative. This was happening with a lot of other issues at the time, too, like cannabis and psychedelics. There was a lot of information online suggesting that they weren't actually as dangerous as we have been led to believe, but were only made illegal because of corporate interest and government fear mongering. A lot of that research was legit, and the media was lying about the wars and covering for the bankers that were responsible for the financial crash. So it really seemed like this new technology was cutting through centuries of propaganda to enlighten the world. Looking back, it seems crazy and naive, though, especially considering the reality that we're dealing with today. But this was what I was thinking at the time, and I wasn't alone. There was a lot of optimism for the future, because the internet really was changing the world, breaking down cultural barriers and expanding the discourse around pretty much every topic, allowing for more diversity of opinion than we saw in traditional media. It's hard to articulate how this really felt for those of us who were living through it at the time and paying attention, but it felt like anything was possible. Then we started seeing revolutions pop up around the world, and they were being observed in a way that had never really happened before, directly from the phones of the oppressed people in one country to the oppressed people in every other country around the world. It started in Tunisia in December 2010, when a self-immolation sparked massive protests that resulted in the removal of a president. The whole world was watching, and we were getting ideas. By February, there were protests in Egypt, which led to the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak. At the time, both of these revolutions seemed like they were successful, but now that's extremely debatable, especially in the case of Egypt, which quickly turned into a military dictatorship. There was unrest and protest demanding for the government to be replaced in many countries around the world that year. Things were popping off in Europe too, with protesters in Greece, Spain, and even the UK mobilizing against austerity measures and economic suffering that came from the financial crisis of 2008. These movements didn't manage to totally remove the governments that they were protesting against, and in many cases, they just became a part of the political establishment themselves. But I didn't understand that at the time. When I first heard about Occupy Wall Street, I seriously thought that a legit revolution had started. I thought that Occupy Wall Street was the American Spring, similar to the Arab Spring that was toppling dictatorships on the other end of the world. OWS was mostly a leftist movement, but there was also the Tea Party on the right, which was expressing similar populist economic grievances, but from a conservative perspective. So it felt like the whole country was ready for something new, although the Tea Party was more reactionary than revolutionary, which is an important point that I'll get to later. It's interesting, though. You can definitely trace many elements of today's progressive movement back to Occupy Wall Street, and there's also a direct connection between the Tea Party and the New Right. These movements were widely influential and have had ripple effects that we'll be experiencing for decades, but they didn't have the immediate impact that I was expecting at the time. In those days, it really seemed like social media was sparking a long overdue global revolution, where the ruling class would finally be forced to relinquish their power. I'm a bit more cynical now, but I still believe that the rise of the internet and social media are the key factors that led to those years of unrest all over the world. This technology lowered the barrier to entry for information and communication, which allowed people to see how badly they were getting screwed, while at the same time giving them the tools to organize. It also showed us that we weren't alone, and that there were others out there who thought like us. But that didn't seem to be enough, because even though there was plenty of anger and mistrust in the system, nobody could agree on how to solve the problem, which made us very easy to divide. I really didn't notice how bad it actually was until I showed up in person at Occupy Baltimore. I couldn't afford the trip to New York for the main event because I was on probation for possession and dealing with a lot of financial issues at the time because my club was shut down by the cops. But from what I hear, similar conversations were taking place in different cities across the country. It was moderates versus extremists and libertarians versus communists and a variety of other polarizing arguments. I was focused mostly on the moderates versus extremists debate, arguing for the more extreme positions, because I was thinking we were having a revolution. This is another dynamic that was playing out in cities across the country. The discussion was being pushed in the direction of reform and away from revolution. After a while, I stopped showing up because the dialogue got watered down and I wasn't confident that it would amount to anything. The movement did fizzle out, but it was a turning point for many people and had a massive impact on the political conversation globally that is still with us today, even if it wasn't the revolution that I wanted. After Occupy, I took a much deeper interest in anarchist philosophy. I've always considered myself one, but I didn't really have a sophisticated understanding of it. Anarchism is not as cut and dry as you might expect. There are a ton of different conflicting philosophies. I didn't think that any of them had it entirely figured out, and I thought it was a bit ridiculous that they all hated each other. But I guess there is historical precedent for revolutionaries taking each other out after the war is over, so maybe it's not too ridiculous. Also, there are a lot of anarcho-capitalists that have gone full fash or already were to begin with, so maybe they deserve the smoke. Anyway, I always knew that there were different tribes, but I had no clue that things were that bad. I was under the naive impression that everyone who didn't identify with the two-party system would be able to unite against our common enemy in the state. As I've grown older, though, I've learned that the right-left paradigm is more complicated than it appears. It's not as simple as the Democrats representing the left and the Republicans representing the right. In the US, both parties are on the right, just to slightly different degrees, which is why most actual left-wing ideas, like police reform or abolition, demilitarization, or open immigration, are seen as a threat to the establishment and rejected by both parties. They just offer varying degrees of militant nationalist capitalism. This can also be described as liberalism, which means that both Democrats and Republicans could technically fall under the liberal umbrella. This is why a lot of conservatives call themselves classical liberals. So the Democrats and Republicans are both liberal and also both right-wing, which shows you how meaningless all these terms are. Even looking at different systems like capitalism and communism is still too narrow of a focus, because they're very old systems that have never lived up to the promises made by their advocates, and each system has often resulted in the rise of different forms of dictatorships. I've always found the argument about the ideologies of capitalism versus communism as a false dichotomy, and somewhat of a distraction, but when it comes down to the individual issues, I end up agreeing with the communist a majority of the time. Whether it's war, social justice, police brutality, or workers' rights, I often find myself agreeing with them, even though I don't identify with the ideology. Most of my disagreements with them come down to their belief in centralized systems, which I see as being a recipe for corruption, hierarchy, and authority. But at the end of the day, a lot of that is abstract and theoretical. I think we need new ideas, and we shouldn't be anchored to things that dead dudes came up with hundreds of years ago. I mean, sure, we can learn from those who came before us, and there are some general principles that we can derive from the basics, but I think that a lot of our problems come from the fact that we are still running our societies on obsolete operating systems, which is why I've always felt that society needs to be entirely reimagined. That's what many of us were hoping for during the Occupy Wall Street and Tea Party era, but nothing really changed. So the most active and ambitious people in these movements started building platforms online to try to harness some of that energy into new forms of social and political movements. By then, I had already published my first book and was starting to write articles, so I guess I was a part of that new era of activists. In the years following Occupy Wall Street, there was actually a massive rejection of the two-party system, so the communities that I was active in became extremely popular. But that energy would soon be co-opted and funneled right back into the mainstream politics within a few years. starting with Gamergate and the first Trump campaign, which brought an insane level of polarization to nearly every corner of online culture, from political commentators and theory nerds to influencers and furries. It also radically changed the conspiracy culture online, which I paid close attention to since the early 2000s. Back in those days, it was different, though. It was all focused on how we were being lied to about the wars, how the CIA experimented with mind control, or how Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton sold coke and fueled the crack epidemic, how the history of colonialism is whitewashed in schools, or the abuse that the Catholic Church was covering up. It was about questioning power and challenging the patriotic mythology that we have been taught throughout our entire lives. It wasn't all this nonsense that we see today where conspiracies are spread to scapegoat marginalized people and actually defend nationalism and hierarchies. Things were much different back then. One of the most popular conspiracy documentaries at the time was called Zeitgeist, and it was extremely critical of organized religion and capitalism. My first book was pretty heavily focused on that kind of content, the bankers and the billionaires that run the world, how the US government was actually in the wrong in most of its military conquests, and a bunch of trippy hippie stuff too. It's called Alchemy of the Timeless Renaissance, but I really don't recommend that you read it. It's not my best work, and I was in my early 20s and eating a lot of paper at the time. While I was trying to get the word out about the book in 2013, I was able to work my way into a speaking gig at an event in Philadelphia called the Free Your Mind Conference. It was pitched as a conference on consciousness, mind control, and the occult, and some of the most popular researchers on these topics were speaking there. I volunteered to help and I sat in on all the staff meetings leading up to the event, so I was in the room when the organizers got word that one of the speakers couldn't make it, so I asked to take the spot. This was one of my first major speaking appearances, and even though I look a bit crazy, I think the content holds up pretty well. The conference took a year off in 2014, but then it returned in 2015, except it was under new management this time, which was apparently somehow me. It's a long story, but Bob Tuskin inherited the conference from Mark Passio, and Bob knew that I had a history in event management, so he asked me to partner with him to keep it alive. We had a good run for a few years, but things fell apart because there was a lot of drama behind the scenes. That one is a pretty long story, so I'll dedicate an entire video to that sometime in the future. But I think it's actually for the best that that conference ended when it did, because of how that community has changed over the past few years. One of my favorite things about that event was the fact that the audience and the speakers were so eclectic, with so many different areas of interest. Some of us disagreed with each other on some topics, but we were so excited to be around people that were remotely on the similar wavelength that we were willing to overlook the differences. After that conference, I wanted to go to every event and protest that I could find within driving distance, because I was starting to find community with my fellow internet weirdos. A few days after the conference, I noticed that there was going to be a big secret meeting of politicians and corporate aristocrats in Chantilly, Virginia, about 3 hours away from my house. I'll call it the Build-A-Bear group to keep the robots happy, but most of you probably know what I'm talking about. This is a secret organization that is made up of some of the most influential figures in the world. I started writing about the group's history leading up to the event, and one article I put out ended up going pretty viral. It was a sort of call to action for the Occupy movement, calling their attention to some of the richest people in the world having a secret meeting. The article got a good response from both the Occupy movement and the conspiracy-minded, and then the idea was hijacked by a man who would soon become one of the most controversial people of our time. I'll call him Mr. Jones. This was before he went full Fash culture warrior, when he was mostly focused on the police state, secret government operations, and of course the big inside job, which was his claim to fame. He actually had a ton of supporters on the left at the time, because his content was radically different than it is now. For a while, there was a massive overlap between his audience and that of Amy Goodman of Democracy Now!, believe it or not. I was one of these people. I listened to them every day back then. So I was actually pretty excited that my writing got noticed by him. The day after I published the article, he aggregated it on his main site and credited me as an author. Then he went on his show and said that he was calling for an occupation of the conference. I wasn't offended. I thought that it was kind of funny, and I was happy to see the idea get more attention than it would have reached on its own. Plus, he had been covering the topic for years, and he had always showed up at every single conference to try to get footage of who was going in and out, so he would have probably come up with the idea on his own anyway. I got there early before most of the crowds arrived, but all of the journalists were already there recording their monologues or trying to get photos of the tinted town cars pulling into the parking lot of the Marriott where the event was being held. These weren't television or newspaper journalists, though. This was the independent internet media back in its formative years. Most of them seemed very intimidating to me at the time, and they had random people surrounding them like they were celebrities. I hadn't put myself on camera yet for a variety of different reasons. I mean, here I am doing it for pretty much the first time, so I was a stranger to most of the people there, even though many of them had probably read a few of my articles. The crowd was eclectic and came from a variety of different backgrounds and political tribes. I later wrote an article about how inspiring it was to see people coming together against a common enemy. There were definitely some snakes in the grass, though. And I'm not just talking about the obvious undercovers in polos and khakis asking us about our beliefs and motivations. Some of the influencers there ended up going in a really bad direction years later, especially people like Mr. Jones and another grifter named Luke, who would later fight the culture war as a right-wing extremist. I am making a point to bring up these details because over the years I watched as some of these groups and influencers gained the trust of angry, scared, or impressionable people with genuine grievances about wars or the financial system, while slowly exposing them to increasingly toxic ideas. This is one of the many stories that I'm hoping to tell in my book. During my time in the independent media, I met some amazing people who would inspire me to become a better person myself. But I also saw a lot of toxic behavior that would eventually create a disastrous pipeline into fascist ideologies. Early on, I was naive in thinking that everyone involved was idealistic and dedicated to changing the world. Some were, but many others were motivated by money, ego, anger, or unprocessed psychological trauma. On one occasion, while I was freelancing early in my career, an online publisher told me to find something that will scare people because traffic was down that day. I've seen people publish things that I know they didn't agree with just because they knew it would get clicks. The wildest example of this is the Muslim guy that I knew that ran a pro-Trump website even though he didn't agree with any of the content. He said he was making bank off those idiots, and he was. Honestly, I gotta give homie some props for getting his bag. When Donald Trump announced his candidacy, I was very cynical about his campaign. I didn't think that he had a chance of winning, and I thought that he was going to be one of the worst possible options. But I also thought that it might end up being a good thing for him to win. This was easily one of the worst takes I ever had, but I really thought that a Trump presidency would be a disaster and would totally destroy confidence in the government and the political process, allowing the anarchists to step in and build something better. Unfortunately, I was right about the first part, and the second part was insanely naive. The Trump era galvanized support for electoral politics on both sides of the political aisle, and it made the kinds of radical solutions that I was pushing for less relevant, which was the total opposite of what I was hoping for. He was also a lot more dangerous than I expected. Not because I was ignoring the crazy things that he was saying while he was on the campaign trail, but because I honestly believed that the president didn't have any power. I thought that politicians were just actors who were there to take heat for the ruling class, and I still kind of believe that for the most part, but they're on longer leashes than I realized. Trump was able to get many of his terrible policies through, like his extreme immigration restrictions that are now mainstream, and how he stacked the Supreme Court with conservative judges to get abortion protections dropped. He rolled back progress much farther than I expected. I still believe that presidents have very limited power when it comes to changing major policies, but they can direct culture by easily influencing millions of people from the podium. This might have been a new idea to me, but it wasn't new. Theodore Roosevelt, one of the great demons from U.S. history, accurately called this concept the bully pulpit during his reign of terror in the late 19th century. Trump empowered fascist street gangs like the Proud Boys and the Patriot Front and elevated them to paramilitary units that represent an even bigger threat to freedom and peace than he does. He has normalized xenophobia and anti-immigration attitudes by creating a space for these conversations to happen on a national stage, which has pushed the Overton window further in the direction of nationalist authoritarianism. I still believe in a lot of things that would be considered conspiracy. Corporations colluding with governments, secret military projects, and war propaganda. But still, most of the theories floating around on the internet about viral partisan topics are totally bogus and really aren't worth looking into, unless you want to get caught in a spiral of doom where you start to think that literally every news story is a cover for some deeper secret. Another moment that I realized that people around me were really starting to lose the plot was when viral rumors started circulating about every single celebrity death, especially when they took their own lives. Every time a celebrity passed away, stories were published within hours claiming that the star was actually killed by some secret organization because they were about to expose something about child exploitation or trafficking. This was all just made up nonsense, and it actually distracted people from having much needed conversations about mental health and the pressures of the entertainment industry. I remember when a few of these high profile situations happened, I tried to bring up how there were deeper conversations to be had about how people still aren't happy, even though they have everything that anyone could ever imagine wanting at face value. Everyone in the comments just wanted to send me links about how these random celebrities were on the verge of exposing PDF file organizations. There were two websites in particular, one called Your Newswire and another one called Neon Nettle. They seemed to be a part of the Q AstroTurf campaign, and they were hitting viral articles with these celebrity death topics every time one hit the news. They were just blatantly capitalizing on the trending topic with a totally unfounded headline, and they were getting millions of views. These were their most viral topics, but the rest of their content was filled with weird conspiracies where immigrants and queer people were always the villains, and of course the Democrats. This was another sharp divide that started happening in the conspiracy community. It was never partisan. If anything, it was anti-partisan. But now it had become openly and loudly Republican, with some very authoritarian social ideas. It really was like a bunch of those conservative think tanks saw the power in these misfit online communities, so they pumped a bunch of money into a new breed of influencers, media, and activists. This is pretty much what happened. AstroTurfing. Many of the established leaders of the movement began sliding in this direction too, some of them following the money, and others following their hateful hearts. Some claim to be playing devil's advocate or just asking questions, but they exclusively spend their time advocating for or defending reactionary ideas. There are millions of important things happening in the world at any given time, and the topics that people choose to focus on says a lot about them. But even if they're just chasing clicks, it can show who they're pandering to, which is almost just as important. I was initially attracted to conspiracy narratives because they were pointing to injustices in our world that people wanted to ignore. It was about exposing corruption in the government and trying to advance human rights, not just the thrill of completing a puzzle and sharing secret information. I think a lot of people forgot that and just became addicted to always looking for the hidden angle, even when it didn't exist. And I think that led a lot of people in some dangerous directions and opened them up to manipulation and led them away from advocating for human rights. Another community that gathered people who were disenfranchised and funneled them into the fascist pipeline was the Libertarians, and I spent a lot of time with them back in those days too. I had some disagreements with them at the time about their blind worship of capitalism, but they seemed like they could be great allies because they were extremely anti-war and critical of the police. This was also back when they claimed to be socially liberal too, before they chose the wrong side in the culture war. Libertarians in the US have always admitted to being conservative when it comes to economics, but they spun their economic positions to make it look like their suggestions would actually reduce poverty. They did have some valid points in some situations, like the fact that regulations usually end up helping corporations more than they hurt them. This is called regulatory capture, and it seems like the regulatory system is pretty much designed for this purpose. Same thing goes with taxes. Amazon isn't paying taxes, but I am. And those taxes are going directly to bombing poor countries and building prisons for nonviolent offenders. So I think that there's a lot of fair criticism there too. I know that in theory it would be great if taxes were spent on good things and if regulation was targeted in the right direction, but I'm too cynical about the government to think that this would ever happen, because there is always an incentive for the people in charge to use their positions to empower the few at the expense of the many. And remember, I also legitimately thought that we were just a few years away from a massive revolution that would topple the government and allow us to try something new. So I was very receptive to the idea of just entirely cutting the government out of everything because they were just warmongering demons that made everything worse anyway. Plus, if we could prove that the government wasn't needed to pay for the good things, then they wouldn't have any justification for all of the bad things that they did. My opinion on the government hasn't changed since I was caught up in those communities. I still think that we should work towards a society that isn't controlled by organizations that have a monopoly on violence, but I don't think it's good or productive to advocate against providing people with housing and healthcare, especially when billions are spent on bombs and prisons. But the libertarians dedicate a lot of time to opposing policies that would improve the lives of working people. There was also this philosophical principle that they called the non-aggression principle that they claimed directed their thinking on everything, and it's ultimately something that they use as an excuse for their conservative economic positions. The idea of the non-aggression principle was very attractive to me at first, because live and let live is a great concept, but it's defined in a way that always favors property owners in any situation, and always puts them at a legal or moral advantage over those that didn't own any property. It took me a while to figure this out though, because I bought into a lot of their arguments. I did some wild mental gymnastics to talk myself into believing that the policies libertarians were asking for would actually benefit marginalized people. Around this time, there was a lot of debates about how libertarians were in support of sweatshops. And there were, indeed, many libertarian economists with lectures on YouTube and long-form posts on Facebook talking about how sweatshops were actually good, because hey, at least they had jobs. The argument was gross, obviously, and I wanted to push back on it. So I wrote a long article about labor conditions in the Global South, where I appealed to libertarian beliefs in property rights to advocate for the workers. My argument was basically that the ancestors of the people who worked in the sweatshops actually worked the land that the sweatshops were built on, so the workers should be the rightful owners. In most cases, sweatshops were established through the forced displacement of these people, who could have lived off the land or used the land as an asset. Their property rights were violated, and they deserve reparations from the local governments and factory owners. I thought that it was an extremely sound argument, and I still do, but the article got a ton of harsh criticism from the libertarians. I used their philosophy of property rights to advocate for the powerless, and they didn't like it. They were upset that I was trying to say that sweatshops were a bad thing. Seriously, it's insane. I can't even process it. It made me realize that the principles they claimed to have were really just rhetorical tricks to justify a very specific worldview, which was their actual priority. Some people were even openly racist enough to tell me that savages don't believe in property rights, so property rights should not apply to them. I was discovering that many of them actually believed in hierarchies and saw libertarianism as a way of protecting, not dismantling, those hierarchies. The loudest voices in the movement felt this way and became more open about their right-wing views as these debates started happening. It wasn't something that I noticed overnight. It was more of a slow and gradual process of many individual people being radicalized. At first, it seemed like it was just a few weirdos, and I didn't take it very seriously, because there was a kind of radical acceptance in these movements back then where extreme views of all varieties were tolerated. So naturally, a few people with really messed up ideas would pop up every now and then. Somewhere along the way, though, it became more than just a few reclusive old nut jobs. A massive wave of reactionary politics was sweeping the country, and it was finding a captive audience in the fringe corners of the internet that I had called home for so long. It was typical for me to get into debates with libertarians about economics, but even those debates were much darker as time went on. After a while, they stopped pretending to care about economic equality and actually started arguing in favor of it, often suggesting in different ways that the poor are responsible for their own situation, entirely ignoring the mountains of systemic factors that contribute to poverty. In the past, they would at least suggest that their policies would improve the conditions of the poor. Now they were just openly saying that it wasn't their concern. Then, they stopped pretending to care about social freedoms as well. I went back and found a post from late 2015 when I was just starting to notice all this. This was when the alt-right was forming before it was called that. It was the same creeps with the same beliefs, but they were going by different names like the Dark Enlightenment and the New Right or Neo-Reactionaries. In that post, I was talking about well-known libertarians and anarcho-capitalists that were taking a hard right turn and taking their audiences along with them. Around that time, the biggest libertarian event in the country, PorcFest, or the Porcupine Freedom Festival, also made noticeable changes that signaled how the leaders in the movement were abandoning social freedom. I spoke at the event for a few years, and I always thought it was cool that they had a queer dance party on one of the final nights of the festival. But they stopped doing that when the culture shifted, and that kind of thing was happening across the whole scene. The libertarians were saying that as long as people agree on economics and guns and stuff like that, then that's all that's important, and that people should have the right to hate whoever they want, that was a part of libertarianism, which ends up meaning that they only wanted alliances with the right and not anyone on the left. Which was weird to me because the left were way better on war, cops, and all of the important social issues that meant a lot to me. So I really started to question things around that time, because I was starting to see that a lot of libertarians only cared about their own liberty, not anyone else's. Watching the reaction that many libertarians had after the riots in Charlottesville was another big wake-up call for me. As you probably remember, a bunch of crazy creeps paraded through a town with torches, and a young incel drove his car through a group of counter-protesters, taking the life of a young woman. The libertarians were saying that actually, the real crime was that some of the torchbearers were identified through their pictures and lost their job because of the woke mob on the internet tracking down their employers. Which is kind of wild because libertarians love to advocate for bosses to be able to fire their employees in pretty much any situation. I guess racism is an exception. Meanwhile, the conspiracy crowd was saying that it was a setup because the government was trying to make the fascists that they called patriots look bad, as if they needed help with that. It was bizarre to me. I mean, a good part of the reason I considered these two groups to be allies was our mutual disdain for the police and military. So it left me wondering what happened. In such a short time, the whole tone and focus of these movements had shifted. It was no longer about the police, corporate corruption, or the military-industrial complex. It was now all about the culture war and being on the wrong reactionary side of it. Another wild thing about Charlottesville is the fact that former libertarians were involved with the organizing and leading the Tiki Torch Cringe Fest that happened the day before the murder. Christopher Cantwell, a libertarian YouTuber turned fascist, was one of the ringleaders and was featured prominently on a Vice documentary about the riot. He later collaborated with the feds and became known as the Crying Nazi after posting an emotional video in the aftermath of the riots. One of the things that they were chanting in the streets was blood and soil, which was also in the closing line of an article that was published earlier that summer by the Mises Institute, the famous libertarian think tank. Blood and soil is definitely a Nazi thing. There's really no way around that. Either way, the title of that article where it was mentioned was called For a New Libertarian, and it was written by Mises Institute President Jeff Deist. In the article, he basically said that libertarians should be more conservative and not reject things like nationalism and religion, and actually use the words blood and soil. It's weird that he used the term New Libertarian in the title, considering that this was a term that Samuel Edward Konkin started using to describe leftist libertarians back in the early 1980s. Konkin's New Libertarian was in opposition to the paleoconservative libertarians and anarcho-capitalists like Maury Rothbard that were popular in those days. Paleoconservatism was an early version of what we today call the alt-right, an alliance of many different fringe groups that bonded around their shared extreme right-wing views on social issues like race, immigration, and feminism. Rothbard and a handful of other lifelong conservatives, like Lew Rockwell and Walter Block, began promoting a paleoconservative version of libertarianism in the 80s, which came to dominate the Libertarian Party in the U.S. This is why libertarianism in the U.S. is significantly more conservative than it is in other parts of the world. This history is important for me to cover because these figures and their efforts help shape the right-wing faction that dominates American libertarianism today. In fact, many of them are still popular today, directing the movement's culture from think tanks like the Mises Institute or the Koch-backed Cato Institute. But to really understand how we got here, we need to take a look back at the late 70s and early 80s when these organizations were being formed. Murray Rothbard was a central figure in the founding and development of both groups, and he was also one of the most influential American libertarians of his time. He's also responsible for introducing and coining the anarcho-capitalist philosophy, which entirely reframed both libertarianism and anarchism to support hierarchies. Anarchism and libertarianism have both been around for a very long time, and dismantling hierarchies has always been a defining characteristic of both philosophies. They have also both traditionally been anti-capitalist as well, but Rothbard changed all that, at least for those of us in the US. Unfortunately, this mutated, Americanized version of libertarianism has been spreading around the world and has found mainstream adoption in Argentina, where a terminally online nerd took over the government. I think in the future, I'm going to dedicate an entire video to my problems with anarcho-capitalism and how the philosophy of agorism was created in opposition to it, only to be co-opted by reactionaries in the past decade. That's a deep rabbit hole though, so I'll save it for another day. Please click the like button on this video and subscribe if you haven't yet, and let me know what you think in the comments. I'll catch you next time.